there's if you haven't read this book, please do. Finland O'Toole on Brexit. This is what the British civil servant who was sent along to the meeting of the Iron and Steel community in Messina in November '55. He was sent along to see what this common market thing. Let's see what he wrote. It's only a paragraph. The future treaty which you are discussing has no chance of being agreed. It was agreed it has no chance of being ratified. And if it were ratified, it had no chance of being applied. And if it were applied, it would be totally unacceptable to Britain. You speak of agriculture, which we don't like, of power over customs, which we take exception to, and institutions which frightens us. Monsieur le President, Monsieur, au revoir and bonne chance. That tells you something about the British relation to Europe, doesn't it? Back from 1955. Star panel, let them introduce themselves. Steve, a 1-minute introduction to yourself.
Okay, Stephen Carr. I'm a farmer in East Sussex. I have an organic beef herd, organic sheep flock, and I've written for a series of farming magazines and Private Eye over the last 30 years as bio-waste spreader in the Eye, and mostly under my own name in the farming press.
Caroline, who edited the book.
I'm Caroline Stocks. I'm an agricultural journalist. I write about food, farming and the environment for farming publications in the UK and around the rest of the world. And as John said, I've been in charge of editing this book.
Speak Kendall.
Please, Peter. I'm Peter Kendall. I'm a farmer. I went to Nottingham University and didn't spend most of my younger years with farmers. And I got involved in farming politics because everyone following Foot and Mouth and BSE was really doom and gloom. And I stood up and said, this is a really exciting industry. It's really central to all the big global challenges of what's going on around the world at this moment in time. And just by circumstance, found myself being president of the NFU for 8 years. I now chair the Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board. But at heart, I'm really kind of very boring farming individual. I love being outside on the farm. I love seeing my farm improve. Would be a better day off than having the Labrador and just walking crops and saying sod the city.
You were on the farm this morning at 7:30.
I was on the farm this morning at 5 o'clock. I didn't leave the farm until 7:30 this morning. That's what I was telling earlier on.
This is a momentous day. It's the start of a new era, the Bojo era. Are you confident?
No. Confident of, I think, possibly more confident that we'll end up leaving the European Union, which I'm fundamentally opposed to. But if this is in a farming context, as I think I made clear in the introductions that I've written for this, I think that it's likely to be an absolute disaster for British farmers. So I had confidence that there's a much better chance of achieving a withdrawal agreement, and if not, then a much higher probability of a leave without a deal.
So both?
Both.
Higher chance of withdrawal and high probability of leaving?
Yes.
First of all, everybody says, Peter, are you confident at the beginning of the Bojo era?
It's interesting when you see his appointment of Chief Whip yesterday, Mark Spencer, who's a Nottinghamshire farmer, who's a very staunch Remainer, that despite all the strong language, do or die, the ridiculous holding up of the Tipper, which was a complete false story. You worry about the detail, particularly around agriculture, trade and all the rest of it. It's massively worrying. That appointment of Mark Spencer tells me that there's a bit of thought gone in to how he's going to try and manage the party. From somebody who is a quiet person who's got a reputation for building relationships. I know him a bit. Really quite a surprising choice. It tells me this is somebody who is not going to be just the stand-up comedian that he appeared to be yesterday when he did his acceptance speech. He's going to try and build a team now. In 3 hours' time, when he appoints Priti Patel to being Foreign Secretary, I might be reversing all of that. He's gone 180 degrees in the opposite direction. It's really difficult to tell. But if you've got somebody who's so unbelievably ambitious as he is, being a 3-month PM would look awful on his CV. and we would have to judge himself as being a monumental failure. So I'm looking forward to someone who's actually going to try and bring people together. Otherwise, all his ambitions will turn out to be nothing.
Caroline, you've reported the industry for 15 years. Confident with the mojo era?
Not obviously as confident as Peter, perhaps. I agree that he's very, very ambitious, and I think he's going to do whatever he can to deliver on Brexit. But what worries me most from an agricultural perspective is him just pushing for Brexit kind of remorselessly and us ending up with no deal, and that is what I think would be fairly catastrophic for several sectors of this industry.
The point surely is that the Conservatives won't dare face an electorate until they've got Brexit, because then they'll face the Brexit. If they do, they'll face the Brexit Party at a general election, which will be political annihilation.
The Telegraph says today that it's Brexit by Halloween or he's toast by Christmas.
Yeah. But I think
I try to avoid reading the Telegraph as a rule.
yeah, he's bound to try. Obviously, the Conservatives are more concerned about their own future than the country's future. So they have to achieve Brexit before they face the electorate. And so therefore, whereas May might have equivocated, he will not. And
So
the people behind him now will drive that forward to try to ensure some sort of political survival.
There's a rumour of an October 24th general election amongst returning officers. Who will be Michael Gove? Who is the new Michael Gove?
It could be Michael Gove. I've been in meetings where he's quite openly told people he's wants to stay, and he's enjoyed the job and he's there. But Tim Shipman seems to be the most well-informed person, I think, writing in the Sunday Times, says he's moving on, he's going somewhere else. But actually, just before I sort of go for where we go next, Michael Gove's been actually incredibly impressive. Incredibly impressive. You've seen DEFRA civil servants with more confidence, with more upbeat, walking a foot taller, because they've got someone who really, and he's changed. He's changed from someone who came in, and I've seen him at meetings where he just dismissed concerns about Brexit and no deal by saying, don't worry, it'll be sorted, and retailers, processors talking about shortage of labour. He just dismissed it, to now for someone who's probably, I think, been one of the strongest advocates in Cabinet against the no-deal Brexit. I think he's been quite clear about the dangers to food and farming. So from a personal perspective, I think it'd be a shame if we lose Michael Gove. Why? Because you've got somebody who's obviously right at the centre of things, listened to, has impact, and is a big hitter. If for fear of being really undiplomatic, I'm not sure DEFRA's always had that calibre of people in those positions. I'm not going to be specific any more than that.
Has he mastered the brief?
Oh yes, Christ, he is unbelievably impressive. He has got a brain the size of a house, and he remembers everybody. He remembers
The journalist, after all.
He is impressive, and unbelievable and charming to a degree that is disarming, particularly for someone like me as a farmer, who would rather have a sort of more head-on discussion around what's going wrong. I just hope they maintain, and I think because of the massive, and this is highlighted in the book, because of the massive impact of Brexit on agriculture and the rural communities, it's got to be a big post. DEFRA can't be that backwater that, we've got to balance up people from around the country or different wings of the party, we push them into that role. It needs to be somebody who is right at the centre of decision making and carries weight around Cabinet. Because as we all know from what we're talking about now, agriculture is right at the eye of the storm.
Inside information, Caroline, who's going to be Michael Gove?
I wouldn't like to guess, because I was quite surprised when we got going in the first place, but he's been a really pleasant surprise, I think. DEFRA has long been kind of a stepping stone, I think, for either up-and-coming MPs, and you kind of knew that whoever was going to come was going to be there for a year or two, if that, and then go on to a
Like culture as a stepping stone.
Yeah, pretty much. Or it's kind of even a punishment, when you look at perhaps some of the other people we've had recently. And the good thing about Gove is he's ambitious. he just works really hard, and he really knows his stuff. And like Peter was saying, he's just so charming, isn't he? As well, when you see you, it's great to see him. You can totally remember who you are, and it's completely disarming for farmers who haven't had that in the past. They haven't had people that really care about the portfolio. So I'll be sad to see him go, which I never thought I'd say, but he's really good.
Does he master detail?
Absolutely, Christ. There's this, as from somebody who, and I don't mean this, I'm a farmer and I'm not particularly well educated, but this bloke is just massively impressive. He has got enormous capacity to drill down to what the important issues are in a discussion.
Is that your view as well, Steve?
No. No, he's obviously the ultimate Brexit salesman. He's only ever thought about one thing since he was at Oxford, winning debates there, presumably in the same sort of snake oil way and in terms of detail, where's the detail? I mean, we are now we're over 3 years from the referendum result. We've got a lot of sort of fancy notions of public goods for public money, but there's absolutely no detail attached to that. The agricultural bill has been conveniently kicked into the long grass because he is only really effectively a politician, and it has been too difficult to progress anything like a coherent policy because it raises all sorts of unpleasant issues within cabinet, within the party, whether it be tariffs, anything like that. Nobody's tried to discuss it. Even relative Euro files within the cabinet, like Hammond, were shouting at him within minutes of raising the possibility of maintaining any tariffs for agriculture. So all dropped, all pushed away, forget about it. It's had its first or second reading and it's been completely parked. He's just an operator selling Brexit. He's beguiled Peter, sadly. And
Caroline, but
I'm having none of them, I'm afraid.
Right, Zach Goldsmith.
I'm sorry?
Zach Goldsmith has been touted for the job.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, maybe that's out of the frying pan into the fire, I think. But he's obviously a committed environmentalist, which of course Gove is not particularly.
Pretends to be. He pretends to be.
Pretends, well, yes, but I mean, it didn't come to the post with any history of environmentalism. Was obviously that is Zach's only sort of brand. I guess like his father, he's probably incredibly Eurosceptic. That might not be fair. I don't know his politics on Europe. So if he brings those two things, well, it'll bring a particular view of agricultural policy.
Caroline, any view on Zach Goldsmith?
Having a very strong environmentalist in a DEFRA role would concern me a lot. I think that we've seen from the draft policy that's been put together, there's a lot of focus on environmental elements and trying to justify the subsidies that farmers get by ensuring that they look after the environment, which is great in certain respects, but the neglect of food production and the lack of conversation about not necessarily securing food supplies, but ensuring that farmers actually produce food, which is one of their key jobs. I think that's been neglected quite heavily, and that concerns me.
Peter, you're a fan of young Goldsmith?
Look, I'm not picking a fight with Stephen, but the fact that the one thing about Gove, and you touched on it with Philip Hammond, is I've heard stories that Philip Hammond said the only good thing about Brexit is you won't pay the ... farmers, right? Now that's somebody who's a staunch Remainer. So you have Michael Gove, who is can win debates around the cabinet table, who made some really strong arguments around tariffs to protect the sheep industry, for example. Didn't help my arable sector, by the way. There's no mention of that. But you had someone there, Michael Gove, who was able to have real weight and standing around the cabinet table. I don't think, and I've been racking my brains, I don't think Zach Goldsmith's held even a junior ministerial role, which I think would be really, really surprising. Yes, he's a mate, he's an old Etonian mate of Boris's, and he's always he's been talked about again by I think the Sunday Times as being a potential environment minister. Have someone coming in with no experience of running a department, how you manage civil servants, how you get things done, how you win arguments around the cabinet table. It's why my choice for a replacement to go would be another big hitter, someone who is going to understand, who is going to go and talk to the industry, realise some of the nuances of your businesses, Stephen. Rather than just sitting there and thinking it's all going to be turned and rewilded or whatever it is. How do the markets work? How do farmers react? What motivates us? Rather than just having someone who really isn't experienced in making things happen.
Main Fantasy Minister, who would you like as the next minister?
I beg pardon?
Who would you like as the next Agriculture Minister?
Goodness me, let me think about that.
Rory Stewart. Rory Stewart.
Well, he won't get
He won't serve at all. I don't
Before we move on, who has been the worst Agriculture Minister in your experience?
This is on the record, you can't do that.
Why not?
I could do a league table, but that wouldn't be fair.
Well, I'm happy to wade in with that. Spellman was hopeless, I think.
She's now a Dave, isn't she?
Yes. Gosh, goodness me! It's
Come on, it was Carol Spellman, it was Owen Patterson, it was Liz Truss, and then it was Andrea Ledson.
Yeah.
All of those were bad?
I didn't know.
Caroline, who's your experience? Who was the worst?
No way.
No, okay.
Yeah.
Can I make one point on
Right.
that? What's amazing is that the Labour Party, who haven't got a close affinity with the farming industry, have picked some quite impressive Secretary of States over the years. Now, I disagreed with Margaret Beckett on almost everything she did, but actually she was a very effective politician, and she knew how to get things done around Westminster. So policies were wrong. David Miliband is probably one of the most impressive politicians I've ever met and worked with. Problem was, after he thought he'd solved it in 6 months, he moved on to running the rest of the world and wanted to be Prime Minister. And Hilary Benn is probably one of the nicest men you'll ever meet. And the best thing about Hilary Benn was he listened and sometimes changed his mind. And that's bloody rare.
Well, is Ben about to join the Conservatives? I don't know. Is that on the cards? I don't think so.
Moving forward to the 1st of November and the book title, Farmageddon. Paint us a picture. Where are we going to be on the 1st of November? Assuming a no-deal Brexit, what's going to happen to farming?
A no-deal Brexit. Well, as things have been presented, we face the immediate crisis in terms of exports, I suppose, is lamb. That is about the only crisis in terms of British exports, because we don't really export anything other than lamb on any scale. I think a small quantity of malting barley goes to Europe, but on every other commodity we are net importers.
Did I not hear Jacob Rees-Mogg say we sent it to New Zealand this morning?
We're going to send lamb to New Zealand.
That's what I thought.
Yeah,
Sounds like
that's about right. That's about right from him. Then we face varying degrees of tariff cuts as European tariffs are dismantled that protect British agriculture at the moment to a quite extraordinary degree. And so, if that is followed through, we will see we will see cheap imports of food from just about everywhere, but particularly, there's been a lot of fuss about chlorinated chicken from the US, but I think that's just froth. The real threat is from the developing, or the less economically developed countries, particularly those with weak currencies, which invariably is the case as well. So yeah, that's where the threat comes from. And if we're only talking about modest or no tariffs on those imports, then the impact will be enormous and rapid. And just as and if they maintain Gove's policy of winding down the BPS,
What's BPS?
the basic payment scheme, which is what British agriculture has been living on almost entirely for the last decade. It's net income, as an industry is barely the amount of money that is the BPS. So take that away, the industry is virtually devoid of income already. So if that's going to be followed through, plus a crash in commodity prices because of withdrawal tariffs, I don't know what proportion of farmers would be left solvent within a very short space of time.
You're a beef farmer, how is it going to affect you and your prices?
Well, I think it'll cut, as proposed, it will cut the beef price by about 25 to 30%. So take the value of an average bullock in the UK, fat animal, from about £1,200 to about £900, which, bearing in mind, probably 4 out of 5 producers, maybe even more than that, are already trading at a loss, would crash the sector very quickly and collapse production.
You think it's a catastrophe, Peter? That's the start of your chapter.
I do, but I'm not sure on the 1st of November exactly what happens. I think I personally think no deal Brexit is so mad, so insane.
That's likely to happen.
There's no politician with the evidence in front of them is going to sanction it. And I've sat there, as I said, I've explained earlier on, I've seen Michael Gove talking to the food industry, understanding supply chains, understanding it's not just food coming into the UK, it's the contagion of the lorries that come in needing to get loaded up and then go out again. And if they get held up, the whole thing bottlenecks incredibly quickly. I talked to a guy in Northern Ireland who's a big dairy processor. He makes yogurts. He has plastics for the containers, 4 different types of plastic, and they come in 4 different containers from different parts of Europe. One of those gets held up and the product doesn't get produced. Supply chains now are unbelievably complex, and this doesn't take long before the whole thing grinds to a halt. You might find in the short term there's a temporary boost to British agriculture, but the supply chains will grind to a halt.
From a no deal? Boost from no deal?
But by shortage or unavailability of product. The product is like people say to me, don't worry, we're not going to have, we're not going to be short of food. Now the problem is though, if in this day and age there's one product you can't get when you go to Sainsbury's or Tesco's, for you that's a food shortage, because you're used to getting it and having it day in, day out. And there will be all sorts of problems, which I just think when the politicians look at it, it will be so detrimental. The no deal is just so unbelievably unrealistic. My major concerns are over the tariff proposals, the leaving Europe, even if it's in a phase winding down of the support the tariffs that Stephen talks about, is we've done this madness before. The corn laws, for different reasons at a different time, saw the UK go from producing 80% of its wheat to 20% at the start of the First World War. Politicians said they'd never let that happen again. Of course, we had the financial crash of the 1930s. They couldn't afford to give support to farming. We ended up with the U-boats, and we weren't producing enough food again. Today we've got climate change. We've got Russia being the biggest wheat exporter in the world. And remember in 2008 when they had a shortage of grain, they banned exports. You know, look at the impact of China today. African swine fever, they have 50% of the world's pigs, and they're slaughtering on a massive scale and going out and buying pork from around the world. They're distorting all those markets. In climate change, with global geopolitics as they are today, running down our food system would be insane. But I fear that the corollary of a hard Brexit, I'm talking about a hard Brexit rather than a no deal, is as you hear Jacob Rees-Mogg say repeatedly, Nigel Farage, we're going to have cheap food.
I was going to start a point, sorry to come over all Jacob Rees-Mogg, he says under WTO, under WTO rules, we'll have lots of cheap food. What are we complaining about?
Well, indeed,
Cheap food.
and I think that is a perfectly valid observation on his part, a rare one. That if you have WTO, you will have, the British consumer will certainly have cheaper food. There's no argument
What's wrong
with
with
that.
that?
Well, food security, I suppose, is the obvious difficulty with it. That it would quickly render UK almost entirely reliant on imported food, and it's just a political decision about whether that is sensible. I mean, I think probably farmers can't be trusted to give an objective answer. But as Peter was alluding to, it caused us terrible difficulties before to find ourselves so dependent on imported food, and while more obviously has this sort of bizarre sort of nostalgia for Commonwealth Empire and some sort of return to exporting ploughshares and importing wheat as a sort of trade balance, it didn't really pan out very well for the country, and certainly not well for the countryside and for the rural economy and for farmers. So as a farmer, I'm bound to be anxious about it, because the farm I farm in East Sussex, a third of that was abandoned in the 20s, and my family weren't farming it then, but my father's first sort of involvement in agriculture was even in the 1950s, clearing scrub and abandoned farmland for the first 10, 15 years of his career. One of his main was buying land that had been abandoned 20, 30 years earlier. I think probably East Sussex, probably something like a third of the county, was abandoned between 1925 and the outbreak of war.
Caroline, what's wrong with cheap food?
It's really hard. I mean, from a consumer perspective, that's what people want. Though we can see that there's more people going to food banks and people struggling to get nutritious food. But the problem is from an environmental perspective and from kind of the country's culture. Is it something that we really want to do? Because we're going to be getting to a point where farmers are being forced out of production because they just can't afford to compete. And I don't know if people might say that they want to have cheap food, but then people also want to enjoy the countryside and they want to see a landscape that we've always had and we've always known.
Who will be the big losers? Will there be riots in the streets of North Wales as sheep get burnt? First off,
well, the trouble with agriculture is what is a typical farmer? As Peter knows, as Carr knows, one goes from small-scale tenanted farmers on perhaps with debt to the Duke of Westminster, the Prince of Wales, James Dyson, who have unlimited personal wealth and can probably subsidise a loss-making farm indefinitely. Whereas the other extreme, they might be insolvent within months. So it's very difficult to say, but I think that all sectors
haven't got surplus spend, so they're looking at the shopping in a really critical way, and I think wherever you go, there is a massive driver for affordable food. The bit that concerns me about the drive, the view that we can just, in lots of examples, we're going to deregulate. We're going to make farming or UK industry out of Europe. We're going to have a bonfire of regulation, and we're going to be able to compete anywhere around the world. The beauty of, and I'm talking now as an arable farmer, the EU has a tariff protection against dumping of grains. So if the Ukraine has a bumper harvest, they can put 800,000 tonnes into our market. That's negotiated over time. That understands that it gives them a market outlet, etc. And if it goes above that, it goes, instead of paying 12 euros a tonne to, I think it's 95 euros a tonne. If we come out of Europe, we have no tariff rate quotas at all. Put a big red line around Donald Trump's USA. That is a seriously protectionist bloc in the world. Put another dark black line around the EU. When the Ukraine has a bumper harvest, the implications for my grains are enormous. And once you start having a run of times where you're just not investing, where you're having pressure on prices, you see, I think, underinvestment, you see the drainage going, you see the infrastructure disappearing from the countryside. I genuinely am optimistic for agriculture in the medium to long term, because of population growth, because of climate change, all those.
You're quite
aspects.
incurable, Peter, on that.
I've always been optimistic, you know. That's why I talked about being a farmer earlier on. But the danger is we knacker it in the medium term. We lose that capacity. We lose the skill base. We lose the infrastructure. I'm like you, Steve. A lot of my farmers cleared heavy land, flat clay by people during the war. Why? Because it was marginal land. We've invested massively in that with drainage, improved ditches, building soil fertility and what have you. Once you start losing that, it takes a long, long time to build that back in and bring that productive capacity back.
Any views on cheap food?
I just think, just it's quite interesting in the book, there's a chapter that's written by George Eustace, who was Farm Minister at the time, and he since resigned over the Brexit vote, but he talks about not necessarily being concerned about the tariff issues, and where the real potential lies is for British farmers to start replacing some of the shortfall in imports. And I just think that that's a really interesting perspective for a politician to have, or for somebody in DEFRA to have, because nobody wants, I mean, we grow potatoes, turnips, we don't grow the kinds of things that people want. As you were saying, if you go to the supermarket and strawberries aren't there in December, then you're horrified because you want something for your fruit salad at Christmas. It's just madness. And we've come to that position where potentially we're putting that at risk, and it just seems a strange approach to me.
Who will be the winners? In any form of hard Brexit or no deal?
In terms of British agriculture?
Yes.
I don't really see any winners. Where British agriculture has been exposed to free trade in the past, if that's what we're talking about, we'll probably see the arable area shrink back to the very best land. That probably involves something like a 2/3 drop from the current acreage. That would be a rough estimate. We'd see beef and sheep farming decimated, and dairying affected adversely. Just how much cheap butter, yogurt, those kinds of products would come in. And then there's the pork and one might say the intensive farming Peter's obviously got involved in recent years. Broiler chicken, eggs, pork. That they would seem to be they have the best chance. They're certainly faced with cheap grain, but even they, I suspect, would be in trouble nonetheless, because fundamentally even pork and chicken can be got around the world quite quickly and quite cheaply, and one only needs to find a country with the right conditions, the right circumstances, and a weak currency, and a bit like Peter's example of the Ukrainian wheat.
Weak currency like Britain. So you're going to lose 2/3 of your farm in the next 10 years. Is that your forecast, your business plan?
I'm actually already, this harvest, we're stopping contract farming on a fairly big chunk. We're going to concentrate on what we do for ourselves rather than lose money contract farming for other people, and prepare for some of the change that we've talked about doing. On the chicken side, and I'm looking to expand my chickens at the moment, because the demand for fresh chicken is still growing strongly. But that's not without risk. It's enormous risk in that. Why? Because so much is eaten out of the home now. So 50% of our calories are eaten outside the home. And how many people, when you go to a fast food joint or whether you go to a restaurant, ask where the chicken's produced? People aren't. There's an awful amount of frozen product can come in, and that's where the risk is to the market. So we could see the UK broiler industry shrink because some of that sector is outsourced, as Stephen said, to other parts of the country. What I'm hoping is with modern, really efficient units, the fresh market that the supermarkets want to demonstrate is just-in-time supply chains will give a reasonable return, certainly in comparison with the other things that we're talking about being badly affected. But I can see my farming changing without a shadow of a doubt, and it will be painful because going back again to my introduction at the start, I am a fairly boring, individual who loves his farm, wants to be producing food in an efficient, competitive way, and emotionally that's really tough to walk away from saying, actually, I'm not doing that anymore. It's been quite difficult cutting back on doing contract farming. There's a bit of my colleagues saying, oh, you're not. Why are you cutting back? Why are you doing? I said, actually, I'm planning for the future. I'm going to do things in a different way. But that sort of change, it's more than just financial. It's emotional with farmers as well.
Yeah, and British agriculture is fundamentally not a globally competitive industry, and I mean, Peter and I have disagreed a little bit about that over a number of years. But I've always regarded agriculture essentially as a primary industry. It's like coal mining, it's like steel. These industries do not thrive in developed economies. And agriculture has been, because of the CAP, agriculture has been the last holdout of a subsidised primary industry in Europe. And we now face this reckoning. If that's going to be taken away, almost uniquely, frankly, in the UK, there isn't another developed country really that proposes to expose its agriculture to the withdrawal of any subsidy and exposure to something approaching free trade. So I think. Yeah.
Come on, finish off.
So I think it is a watershed moment for the industry, if that's what's going to happen, and no amount of Peter's optimism is going to save us.
Now, Boris's best friend, the Northern American Boris, as Trump announces that Boris is the British Trump.
He said Britain Trump.
He did.
What does that
He
mean?
doesn't have apostrophes in it. I'm surprised he didn't talk about the airports. But he wants to have free trade with the NHS, wants to have free trade with agriculture. What effect will America have on British agriculture? If you allow.
Well, he doesn't have free. I mean, as Peter's already pointed out, the US doesn't have free trade in anything. It's the US agriculture bill runs into, is it trillions of dollars? I think it's just off the scale of subsidy.
I describe them as agricultural imperialists.
Yeah.
They build shipping terminals around the world to get their products in, and no one else can use them. They are unbelievably aggressive trading around the world. And if we think we stand a chance with 65 million people doing trade deals with Donald Trump on agriculture, we will be just absolutely served up on a plate.
Has Liam Fox signed any deals with anybody?
I'm sorry?
Has Liam Fox signed any trade deals with anybody for agriculture?
Isn't it staggering?
The Faroe
But
Islands.
it's taking Liam Fox now to correct Boris Johnson on the charges of trade deals. And actually even Liam Fox has then turned around and supported, I think, Jeremy Hunt. And there was an arch Brexiteer. I think there's a real lesson here in what's transpired with the Canadians, who saw the trade deal, the CETA deal that Europe did with Canada, meaning that actually our cheese exports were growing well, they were doing well. We're now saying that they won't offer the same terms. We could be facing £1,200 a tonne, I think, tariffs on cheddar cheeses that today are going into Canada free. The disparity, and Canada's quite a small economy relative to the US and others. There's three trading blocks in the world that matter, in my opinion, and that's the US, that's China, and that's the EU. And if you're not part of one of those, you're a rule taker, not a rule maker. And that's where we'll be, because we'll be so desperate to get our financial services, our pharmaceuticals, access to the motor industry. Their access will be so much more important to us that we'll be sold down the river.
I think the US is something of a red herring, to repeat that. The threat that the British agriculture faces is from less economically developed countries, I believe. Food exporting countries of that type. Brazil, for instance. I think in terms of Brazil is obviously a hugely food exporting country. The potential is barely tapped, and the reason for that is because, as things stand, Peter's alluding to, for it to export anything to these blocks, it faces an average challenge, I believe, of about 65% on everything that comes out of the country. That's the average. There are semi-arid areas of Brazil equivalent to all of the cultivated land in the United States that is as yet untouched. But economists that have looked at these regions conclude that if the US took down its tariffs, and if Europe did the same, that land would then be viable. So if we are talking about that in the UK as a trade policy, opening our door, then that sort of production from that sort of land would soon be coming here. Pete's right, it wouldn't happen on the 1st of November, but 10 years down the track, and probably significantly less than that, we'd be facing production from that kind of country.
See if it goes on. Michael goes.
Farmageddon. Let's get out. Yeah, so I think I do worry that the US is something of a distraction. That it is not fundamentally a very efficient country.
But it
produces
produces
food.
an awful lot of food.
Nor it does produce a lot of food, but it's not efficient.
Yeah.
It's not the big risk.
But see, because of their politics, because of
Yeah.
their 2 senators per state, it's massively important politically, and they'll continue to get support, and they'll continue to have the vast majority of soy that's traded around the world is coming from the States, maize, etc. They're really big players. I don't see that diminishing at any point. The way Trump is fighting trade wars with China and Mexico, they're the biggest markets. And he just bungs 12 billion or another 12 billion, another 10 billion to his American farmers to keep them happy. Politically, it's massively important. I don't see the US not being big players in
But
global
I
markets.
still think that it's the bigger risk. I hear what you say, but I think the bigger risk is from other countries. And another important part of that is politically, it's harder for British agriculture to resist the politics based around allowing imports from less economically developed countries. All very well, and Peter's able to point to the US as something of a trade bully and very unpopular president, certainly in Europe. But it's harder to actually mount a defence as a farmer against effectively emancipating, empowering farmers in less economically developed countries to send their product here. And I think that's where the larger risk is for British agriculture, as in terms of making its case for self-sufficiency. It's easy to mount a case against North America generally, but these other countries I think are the big risk.
Let me take you to a supermarket, Sainsbury's in Hayford Hill in Oxford. It has a world food section, it's half an hour. In 5 or 10 years' time, will that be 2 hours, 3 hours, because of free trade? Will the vegetable section be?
I'm trying to pick what sort of Brexit we're having at this moment in time. The worst kind of Brexit, I think, will probably increase the access. I don't see the distribution and sourcing changing that rapidly. What I do see though is our prices and our returns to the industry coming down to a point where the sales of machinery will be a fraction. There'll be a lot of patch and repair. There'll be poorer returns. There'll be the infrastructure will disappear. I remember the first Barney I had with Margaret Beckett in 2006, and the 2006 was really interesting. It was before we had any of the global food price spikes. Margaret Beckett's view then was we were a free trading nation. We could buy our food from anywhere we wanted around the world, and then we could be park keepers. That was the message that was given out in 2006. In 2008, for anyone who hasn't got the history lesson, we had global food price spikes. It was kicked off. It was partly responsible for the Arab Spring, food shortages. You had the new government chief scientist at the time, John Bennington, talking about the global perfect storm of population growth, dietary change through the middle classes, climate change, energy. My optimism, Stephen, is that however this unravels, we're going to decide that agriculture, not through throwing money at it, but through actually facilitating success, growth and investment, will keep some of that on check. What we can't cope with is becoming a dumping ground for peaks and troughs around the world, when there's a surplus of beef somewhere coming, collapsing your market. We've got to have a government that wants the industry to succeed. And we have to have a really serious discussion around that. So I see this being gradual. I'm hoping the lessons, and particularly as we see the younger generation putting so much focus on climate change, we address this issue with British agriculture, and it creates opportunities. It will be very different, I get that, but I don't see those aisles just being turned over to cheap food from around the world. But for me, who's the vast majority of my income is from agriculture, it's a worrying time for a whole host of reasons.
Have you got any income from agriculture, Peter? If you take the BPS, I don't wish to pin you to an exact figure.
Yep.
If you take the BPS out of your business, are you left with anything?
Yes, but we're farming.
The big basic payment scheme, which is the
Yes.
acreage payment.
So we
That puts you in that puts you in the top 10% of UK. Only 10% of UK arable farms are viable without the subsidy,
Yeah.
and most of those are crowded into Yorkshire, close to the Humber. I think nearly half of them are in one tiny geographic area where the very best land is, and it has the very best, cheapest transport to a deep port terminal.
Okay, so the way I do it is, look, I'm not drawing my income out of that particular business. We run a contracting business that does 3,500 acres of arable contracting. We've got a family partnership that's 2,000 acres. We've got a poultry business, we've got a renewables business, and I get paid for doing the HDB job as well. So we're not a typical business, and we're able to run things in a certain way that, boy, is it important. It's a massive part of our business, that support. But we know that the best performing businesses can adapt to the change. What it can't adapt to is being in dumping ground and seeing prices plummet because you've either got that Ukrainian surplus or some cargoes come in and collapse the beef market in your sector, Stephen. We have to have some sort of protection around the island that stops us just being a dumping ground for cheap produce, because that just stuffs confidence and investment.
There must be something good about Brexit. Caroline, can you see some?
Yes,
Well,
I think.
Sorry, why did any farmer vote for it? That's what I mean.
Well,
I
the
just listened to
issue
this.
is so the relationship that farmers have had with Europe and the Common Agricultural Policy has been massively complicated purely because they try and create a one-size-fits-all policy for 27 member states that actually all have incredibly different farming systems. And you try and create something that works for Germany, and that's not necessarily going to work for the UK. Yet those policies have to be put in place because we're a bloc, a trading bloc. So we've got policies that just are not suiting our sector, and we've got also rules that are put in place by the EU and then interpreted domestically by the UK government. Our government has had a tendency to gold plate a lot of those policies, so it makes farmers very resentful about some of the rules that are put in place, and that's why.
What do you mean gold plate?
There are rules that are kind of taken to the extremes. So I think the good one that's happened recently. I guess the 3-crop rule would be one. So it was a rule that was put in place to try and stop monocultures being farmed across Europe, and the way it was implemented in the UK just made it very, very restrictive for farmers, and ended up having to be kind of rejiggled and reassessed to try and make it practical and workable. But by being put in place in the first instance in a really difficult way, it made farmers automatically resent it, and that's where the complications are.
Is there life after the CAP?
Look, I was going to say that bizarrely that there is potentially an upside of Brexit, is that we can have a more targeted, bespoke UK farming policy. That's just the headline.
When?
Well, no, the problem is agriculture has devolved. So we could move from having a policy that spans 28 member states to now having 4 within the UK. And that's going to be reconciled financially, rules, the fairness of the global level playing field and how that all works. But we could have a policy that allows more flexibility than the current CAP does, and that, I think, if you're looking at the big challenges that are coming our way, that could be a positive. My concern is that whenever we've done this domestically, we've screwed it up. We don't get it right as national policy making. Carr was talking about an example of us gold plating. I'll talk about one where we haven't used the rules sensibly. So neonicotinoid seed dressings on oilseed rape is an example of where actually, and Patterson, who I don't agree with on much, went to Europe and actually made sure that when Europe was banning neonicotinoids, he said, you know, you need a derogation because there could be times when using this seed treatment, it'll mean you use less sprays multiple times in crops, and you should build a derogation. That was the UK having influence that decision making. It's amazing how Denmark still uses that derogation today, and they're probably one of the most environmentally cautious countries you'll come across in Europe. In the first year, DEFRA granted a derogation on 4 counties. One of them was mine. They never did another derogation ever again. So they were involved in setting the rules. They said we should have flexibility. 4 other countries still around Europe have that derogation, I think. I don't think it's run out entirely yet. We're not doing it. And you'll see us having to use a lot more contact sprays because of that. I think we do probably, my hunch is we need to move away from neonicotinoids, but I think there are some challenges around it we need to address. But because of the makeup of the UK, because of we're a very crowded island, because of politics being driven by a lot of marginal seats around big conurbations, the voice of farming in the UK is nothing like the United States I talked about with their senators. It's nothing like it is in France, and it'd be easier to say we're going to turn us into park keepers than it is to turn us into successful food producers. That's my concern.
If you were a French farmer, what would you feel about Britain Brexit? Would you be happy, or French, or indeed German or Italian farmer?
Am I now imagining myself as a French farmer, or imagining how I imagine French
yourself
farmers?
as French farmer.
Imagine myself as a French farmer. Well, I suppose I'd be mildly concerned, because obviously, I suppose a French sheep farmer might be very, very pleased, because
He's lost the Welsh.
yes, because as we all remember from the 80s and 90s, pictures of British lamb being burnt on the auto route south. British lamb has been an issue for French farmers in particular, because British lamb we have a better climate than the massive Centrale for producing lamb, so we've had a big negative impact on French sheep producers. But most others will probably regard it with a degree of concern, because I'm sure we're massive net importers of French food overall. Yeah, so mildly concerned, and that would probably apply to most EU farmers. They send, but I think probably overall they might be very pleased to see the back of us, on the basis that we've been an endless irritation.
Pain in the arse.
Yeah.
Peter, is that your impression?
They'll probably miss the money, the net budget contribution as well. But look, if we, the most favoured nation status rules around tariffs means that if we're going to cut tariffs to other parts of the world, we've got to cut them to Europe as well. So we can't have our cake and eat it, as much as the new Prime Minister is going to tell us we can. We will have to allow access to those French wines in the same way as we do elsewhere. Perhaps they might face more competition from New Zealand or South America, but I think there's South Africa. But I don't think there's massive tariffs keeping those products out at the moment. So I just don't see them losing access to our market. We're going to be so desperate again for our access to their markets that will be zero tariffs on imports from most food products from the EU.
But in terms of the question there, which was, I think,
Why did farmers vote for Brexit?
why did farmers vote for Brexit?
And the majority.
And also, but Caroline's correct response to that, which was the gold plating and all concerns about that. I mean, I feel that British farmers are incredibly complacent about all that kind of thing. And just recently we've heard that I mean, Hunt's during his campaign for leadership, he suddenly discovered that presumably quite a significant number of Tory members were farmers. So we had a focus on the of those with the power of votes. We had a big focus on farming for a couple of days. 6 billion was going to be thrown at the industry. But it's quickly pointed out, I think, by trade experts that what he was proposing was entirely illegal. We couldn't, we under WTO rules, we weren't going to be allowed to protect sectors. So all the kind of notion of take back control that a lot of farmers believe in, we're just swapping one lot of regulation rules for another. I've just always worried that the farmers are there. You know, they've been protected for so long. We've lived now in 60 years of unbroken agricultural protection from our own policies post-war, that then slipped under the auspices of the CAP, became under the auspices of the CAP. But there isn't a farmer alive, really, that can remember having tried to trade under free trade or anything like approaching even remotely free trade conditions. So I think we need to tap into past generations to understand the implications of it.
On the point of why farmers voted, I've spent hours trying to understand what motivated people. And there's a number. I think there's a group of farmers who think they're the best, and this is going to create an opportunity to go out and conquer the world. There's some in the younger generation, maybe. There's this view that I've had some New Zealanders around recently for lunch, and they said they've just done a survey, and they said 82% of New Zealand farmers think they're in the top 25%. I think there's a big chunk of British farmers who think they can just take on the world, and this will create opportunity for them. More deep-seated though, I debated with Owen Patterson at 6 different venues around the country, and I'm doing one up in Skipton where the cattle ring was full of farmers, and concern around changing society was massive. Having people who are of a different skin colour or changing culture, Bradford being made up, and when you try to fork out that my chicken, 80% of my chickens are processed by Eastern European workers. The whole processing sector, we haven't talked about labour. There's a massive concern in horticulture, in the livestock processing sectors around where our workers are going to come from moving forward, because English people don't want to do it. I'm not for a moment suggesting the farming industry is racist. I think change, cultural change, is worrying.
You were gently suggesting that. You're saying they don't like change.
I think there is a I started off at the start with a kind of romantic picture of my farm and what I like and how I value the countryside. So change is something I think for farming is where you live in rural communities. It's very different, and I think that change was a big part of farmers voting for Brexit. Was the speed of change. I think a lot of people talk about the whole speed of a digital world and all the rest of it leaving people behind. I think farmers in remote areas felt some of that.
But I admire your optimism, but every time you open your mouth and tell us things, you completely destroy the reasons for your optimism, and that's how or am I misunderstanding you?
I just think the big global trends point towards farming being much more important as an industry in the future. What I don't want to do is have British agriculture screwed in the short term or medium term, so we're not able to make the most of it.
Last question from me. Farmageddon question mark. Just that. Discuss.
Farmageddon question mark.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, I don't see any upside to it until or unless we got a group of politicians in the UK that were determined to develop a coherent food and agricultural policy. And there's no evidence of that in Westminster. I mean, where's that going to come from? From the Labour Party? I don't somehow think so. They would see agriculture.
Who's the shadow agriculture minister? Do you know?
I do the lady you're going to catch me out on that.
Who is it? No?
But, with risk of I don't see, because it's traditionally with England left to its own devices, all the three main political parties really have a taste for free trade. I think they might use agriculture as some sort of in a petri dish to see what happens. It's less than 0.5% of economic activity. I think there is an aspect of Brexit. If it's Brexit and Brexit Party that's going to be ruling this country for the next few years, where there is almost a requirement to see pain to prove that it's working. I think agriculture might actually fall into that category. Somehow something needs to be seen to be changing, and if agriculture is in a terrible mess, that somehow works with the formula of the Rees-Moggs and that wing of the party, a wing of the party effectively that were beyond the pale 5 years ago, but are now effectively running the country.
You're the rulers now.
Yes.
Caroline, Farmageddon?
Well, I think it's really telling that out of 10 chapters in this book, there are 2 people who contributed who are feeling positive towards Brexit. By and large, one of those is the former farm minister, and the other one was a farmer who has put lots of measures in place to plan for kind of all eventualities, and which is great. And I think there are opportunities out there for farmers who can plan, but production cycles are so long, and we've been messed about with so many deadlines that not many farmers are able to prepare or even have kind of the capacity or the ability to prepare. They don't have the funding. They've been they've been struggling for a while to meet costs of production, and I think that it's those farmers that I'm most concerned about. I think long term there will be opportunities for ones that can ride out the storm and deal with the volatility, but for others I really worry.
And the farm minister is ex-UKIP.
Yeah.
And the farmer you mentioned is on some of the best land in Europe.
Yeah, and I think the
And his wife's always been a UKIP campaigner, he didn't do any other.
I think the only other, the perhaps interesting area I see is if there is, like you were talking before about, a wider policy that brings agriculture in with health, a wider economic aspects, and rather looking at food and farming as a completely separate thing as it has always been, trying to understand how it fits in with keeping the country healthier.
Speak to you and then question. Farmageddon?
Look, I'm, as Stephen's accused me of, I'm an eternal optimist. When you get Liam Fox correcting Boris Johnson on trade deals, the discussions we're having, the debates we're having around the implications of trade, the complexities of these trade deals, the unbalance of going low, even the oil tanker being grabbed in Iran, when we're now going to go to Europe to help us because Donald Trump's told us to get stuff. So we're not waking up to realities every day of what's going on and the mess we're digging for ourselves. So I think there will be some unintended consequences. We're going through such a period of madness. People are making all sorts of ridiculous claims. There will be some real downsides to this. But I'm optimistic that by having meaningful debate, experience, the changes I just talked about, will hopefully, through some things, great comments in private eye, what have you, will raise people's awareness of how damaging this all can be.
Short, sharp questions for you and say who you are.
Yeah.
Yes,